The second those words left my mouth, my husband didn't even blink. No concern, no worry, no gentle hand reaching for mine. Instead, his face twisted into something cold, something cruel. "Of course you got fired," he spat, slamming his laptop shut with enough force to rattle the coffee table. "You've always acted like you're smarter than everyone else. Maybe now reality will finally knock some sense into you." I stood paralyzed in the doorway, still wearing my work clothes, gripping my purse straps like they were the only things tethering me to the earth. I had imagined this moment so differently. In my head, he was supposed to wrap me in his arms. He was supposed to whisper that we'd figure everything out together, that we'd survive anything as long as we had each other. But this wasn't that moment. And he wasn't that man. Here's the truth I hadn't told him yet. I wasn't fired. I had been promoted. After 7 grueling years of late nights, thankless projects, and fighting tooth and nail to prove myself, my company had finally recognized my value. They gave me everything I'd worked for. But as I walked home that evening, replaying how distant Brian had become over the past few months, something deep inside me hesitated. What if he couldn't handle it? What if my success made him resent me? What if earning more than him shattered something fragile in his pride? Brian was raised in a household where men were providers, where masculinity meant being the foundation, the rock. His mother drilled that into him since childhood. I could still hear her voice echoing through our living room like some ancient, outdated scripture. Still, I never expected him to explode. Not like this. I'll never forget the way he looked at me in that moment, like I was a liability, like I was dead weight he'd been dragging behind him without realizing. "Do you even understand what you've done to us?" he shouted, pacing back and forth across the room. "How are we supposed to pay the bills now? How are we supposed to survive?" Not once did he ask how I was feeling. Not once did he ask what happened. I said nothing. Not because I didn't want to defend myself, but because I physically couldn't. My throat had closed up completely, like my body instinctively knew I needed to stay silent. And maybe that was a blessing. Because if I had told him the truth right then, if I had revealed that I'd just been handed the biggest promotion of my career, I would have missed what came next. I would have missed the cracks beneath the surface finally splitting wide open. So I just stood there, frozen, as he raged on, telling me I'd never contributed anything real, that all I ever did was shuffle papers while he built things that actually mattered. I barely remember how that evening ended. I think I locked myself in the bathroom and stood under the shower for 30 minutes straight, letting scalding water burn my skin, hoping it might wash away the humiliation, the confusion, the creeping dread settling into my bones. That night, Brian slept on the couch without a single word. I lay alone in our bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing faster than my heart. The signs had been there. I realized that now. Signs I'd ignored for far too long. The late nights at work with vague explanations. The way his phone was always face down, always locked, always guarded. The way he'd stopped looking me in the eyes when we talked. This wasn't just about my fake firing anymore. Something else was happening, something darker, something sinister. And I could feel it rising beneath my skin, the primal instinct to survive, to uncover the truth before it destroyed me first. Looking back now, the warning signs had been screaming at me for months before I ever tested him. They weren't obvious at first, not glaring red flags, just small things. The way Brian started coming home later and later with excuses that never quite made sense. The way his phone, once casually tossed on the kitchen counter, was now permanently face down, password protected, guarded like state secrets. The way he'd started canceling our Saturday morning breakfasts, something we'd done religiously for years, with nothing more than a shrug and a half-hearted maybe next time. I told myself it was just work stress. His construction company had landed a massive downtown project, and he was putting in longer hours than usual. I wanted so desperately to believe that explanation. I clung to it like a lifeline, because the alternative, the creeping suspicion that the man I'd shared a bed with for a decade might be slipping away, was too painful to confront. But there was one moment that lodged itself permanently in my memory. One moment I kept replaying over and over again, the moment that planted the first seed of doubt. It happened 2 months before I tested him. I'd gotten off work early that Friday afternoon. My team had wrapped up a major product launch ahead of schedule, and I thought it would be romantic to surprise Brian. I imagined cooking his favorite dinner, opening a nice bottle of wine, trying to recapture some piece of the connection we'd been losing. I let myself into the house quietly, expecting to find him working in the living room. But the moment I stepped through the front door, I heard his voice drifting down the hallway. He was on the phone, speaking in a tone I'd never heard before. Serious, Clipped, almost rehearsed. No, she doesn't suspect anything yet, he said. A long pause followed. We just need a little more time. Then he laughed, but it wasn't the warm, playful laugh I once fell in love with. This laugh was different. Cold, detached. Almost cruel. I stood frozen in the hallway, clutching the doorframe, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. He was talking about me. I knew it deep in my gut. I didn't hear the other person's voice. Maybe it was on speaker, maybe not, but the weight of that conversation settled on my chest like a boulder. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, as if nothing had happened, Brian walked out of the bedroom, saw me standing there, and smiled. He kissed me on the cheek like it was just another ordinary day. I smiled back. I went into the kitchen. I started boiling pasta like everything was fine, but something cracked inside me that evening. A quiet fracture, invisible on the surface but spreading rapidly underneath. From that day forward, I started watching him differently, listening more carefully, picking up on every subtle shift in his behavior. The way he avoided discussing our future. The way he grew impatient whenever I asked about his day. The little lies he told without even realizing I'd caught them. I wasn't being paranoid. I wasn't losing my mind. My gut was screaming at me, and I was finally ready to listen. It was a strange kind of grief, mourning the slow death of something while still pretending it was alive. I kept telling myself to wait, to gather more evidence, to be absolutely certain. Until that moment after my fake firing, when the last of my illusions came crashing down. That's when I understood something bigger was happening, something I hadn't even begun to imagine, but I was about to find out. And once I did, there would be no going back. It was around 2 o'clock in the afternoon when I heard the front door swing open. I had stayed home from work that day, claiming to feel unwell. The truth was, I needed space to think, to process, to plan. Brian still believed I was unemployed, devastated, too broken to face the world. He had no idea I was still working, no idea about my promotion, no idea I was using this time to quietly, carefully piece together what was really happening. I froze when I heard not one voice, but two. The second voice didn't belong to a coworker or friend. It belonged to Linda, my mother-in-law. I crept silently into the hallway, positioning myself just beyond the crack of the guest room door. I knew I shouldn't eavesdrop, but something about the way they spoke so casually in the middle of a weekday made every hair on my arm stand straight up. So, Linda's voice rang out sharp and familiar. Why the sudden visit? Everything going according to plan? Everything's going exactly as we hoped, Brian replied, sounding almost pleased with himself. She told me she got fired yesterday, completely devastated, just like you predicted. I slapped my hand over my mouth to suppress a gasp. Finally, Linda exhaled with undisguised satisfaction. She won't have any choice now. She'll have to agree to whatever terms we set. My knees buckled. I pressed my back against the wall, heart thundering so violently I could barely hear what came next. She's completely dependent on me now, Brian continued. Selling the house is just a matter of time. Linda let out a smug little chuckle that made my stomach turn. I told you from the beginning that girl was never right for you. Too ambitious. Too independent. You really think she'd have stayed if it weren't for your father's house? The words hit me like a punch to the chest. That house had been our home for 10 years. I'd poured everything into it, my time, my money, my heart and soul. And now they were plotting to sell it out from under me like I was just some tenant they'd finally managed to evict. Don't start, Mom, Brian sighed. We already discussed this. And what about Claire? Linda pressed. And are you going to tell her it's finally time? Claire. The name sliced through me like ice water down my spine. Claire Jennings, I knew her vaguely. She had been Mark's girlfriend before the accident. Mark, Brian's older brother who died in a car crash 3 years ago. Claire had disappeared after the funeral. I had no idea Brian had stayed in contact with her, let alone that she was somehow involved in this. She's ready, Brian said, his voice suddenly softer, almost tender. The baby's doing great. Growing fast, already looks just like Mark. My stomach twisted so violently I nearly doubled over. I'll adopt him as soon as the divorce goes through, Brian continued, discussing it as casually as a business transaction. He'll be my son, our son. I couldn't breathe. Just imagine how happy Claire will be when she hears the house is finally going up for sale, Linda purred. She's waited so long for this. My ears were ringing. My vision blurred at the edges. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a coordinated replacement. They weren't just planning to leave me. They were planning to erase me entirely. And the worst part, I had no idea how long this had been going on. No clue how many smiles, how many kisses, how many I love yous had been nothing but lies. Rehearsed. Strategic. Calculated. My husband wasn't just cheating on me. He was plotting my complete destruction. I always knew Claire was perfect for you, Linda continued, her voice dripping with that sickly sweet tone she reserved only for people she actually liked. You two belong together. It's such a shame you met her too late after you'd already married that one. That one? That's how she referred to me. Not Rachel. Not your wife. Just that one. A placeholder. An obstacle to be removed. I bit down hard on my knuckle to keep from making a sound. Every muscle in my body trembled, but I couldn't stop listening. I needed to hear everything. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Brian muttered. We still need to make sure Rachel doesn't fight us on the divorce. She won't, Linda replied confidently. Not if you handle it correctly. Remind her she has nowhere to go. No job, no savings, no options. She'll fold like a cheap card table. I clenched my fists so tightly my nails dug into my palms. Every nerve in my body was screaming. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was trapped. But they were wrong. And what if she doesn't fold? Linda asked. What if she goes and gets herself a lawyer? Brian's voice dropped low and terrifyingly calm. Then we hit her with the infidelity angle. I nearly stumbled backward. What infidelity? Linda asked. Doesn't matter if it's real, Brian said dismissively. I've got some old photos from that conference she attended 2 years ago. Just her with some colleagues, but they can be interpreted the right way, enough to plant doubt. You're a clever boy, Linda cooed, just like your father was. But Brian wasn't finished. And if that doesn't work, we accuse her of leaking confidential documents. She worked with sensitive client files. She brought work home constantly. I'll testify that I caught her trying to sell proprietary data to competitors. I felt my knees give out completely. I sank slowly to the floor, back pressed against the wall, hands ice cold. My husband, the man who once held my hair back when I was sick, who painted our bedroom walls while I picked out the perfect shade of blue, was planning to systematically destroy my reputation, my career, my entire life. He was going to lie under oath. He was going to accuse me of crimes I never committed, just to push me out and make room for Claire and a baby that wasn't even his. Claire. I remembered her now in fragments from Mark's memorial service. Quiet, soft-spoken, seemingly kind and fragile, I never in a million years imagined she would resurface in my life like this. Not as the woman replacing me, not as the mother of the child my husband planned to raise as his own. How's the baby doing anyway? Brian asked, his voice suddenly light, almost happy. Strong, Linda answered proudly. Claire says he's growing so fast. Same eyes as Mark, same laugh. You'll see for yourself soon enough. The room started spinning around me. They were building a brand new family. Brian, Claire, the baby, and of course Linda, always Linda, pulling the strings. The perfect little unit, carefully constructed on the ashes of my marriage. And in their minds, I was already gone. Just paperwork. Just one final awkward conversation away from being erased completely. I'll tell her tonight, Brian said decisively. She's already fragile after losing her job. It's the perfect time. I'll play the sympathetic husband card, say it's better for both of us, offer her a small amount of cash to walk away quietly. Linda snorted. Lay on the pity, make her feel like a burden, she'll cave. Women like her always do. I bit my lip so hard I tasted copper. But even through the pain and rage, I smiled to myself, just barely, because they didn't know the truth. I hadn't been fired, I had been promoted. And their entire carefully constructed plan was already beginning to crumble. I stayed crouched behind that door long after their conversation ended. I didn't move when I heard the couch creak or when the front door finally closed behind Linda. I just sat there, hugging my knees to my chest, heart hammering so violently I thought it would give me away. My body was frozen solid, but my mind was on fire. This wasn't simply betrayal. This was war. And I had stumbled directly onto the battlefield, completely unarmed, utterly unaware. Until now, but I refused to become a casualty. Not quietly. Not ever. That night, I didn't speak a single word to Brian. He acted like nothing had happened. He poured himself a whiskey, turned on the game, occasionally glanced my direction with that carefully practiced neutral expression that now looked absolutely grotesque. I couldn't meet his eyes. I didn't trust myself. Because if I looked at him directly, I might shatter the illusion, and I desperately needed that illusion to hold, at least for a little while longer. In bed that night, I lay perfectly still with my eyes wide open, back turned to him. He fell asleep quickly as always, breathing deeply and peacefully, as if his day hadn't included plotting to completely erase me from existence. I listened to his breathing and I planned. The next morning, I left the house before sunrise, before he even stirred. I didn't go to work, not yet. Instead, I went straight to the storage closet where we kept old documents, warranties, receipts, contracts, tax returns. I pulled out everything I could find. I needed proof. Evidence that I had contributed substantially to that house, that I had invested real money, not just my presence. The new water heater, my bonus paid for that. The custom cabinetry in the kitchen, my design, my deposit, my vision. I dug out bank statements, delivery invoices, furniture receipts. I packed everything into a box, loaded it into my car, and drove across town to the only person I truly trusted. Emily. Emily Barnes wasn't just a colleague. She was my closest friend. For years, we'd been each other's sanity lifeline during endless late nights at the office. She knew my coffee order by heart, remembered my birthday without reminders, even knew the name of that stray cat I tried and failed miserably to adopt. Most importantly, she had never once betrayed my confidence, not even with harmless gossip. That made her absolutely invaluable now. When I appeared at her doorstep, she didn't bombard me with questions. She just looked at me for a long moment, reading everything in my face, then stepped aside to let me in. "I need a favor," I whispered. "Say no more," she replied. In her kitchen, I spread the documents across her table. "If anything happens to me, if I disappear, if I stop answering calls or texts, give all of this to my lawyer." She raised an eyebrow but stayed silent. "I'm not being paranoid," I added quickly, seeing the concern flooding her expression. "But I can't afford to take any risks right now." Emily nodded slowly. "You're scaring me a little, honestly. But okay, whatever you need, I'm here." I exhaled deeply, feeling the crushing tension in my chest loosen just slightly. I hadn't told her everything yet. Not about Claire, not about the baby, not the full horrifying scope of what I'd overheard. But she understood enough. She understood that something was deeply, terribly wrong, that I needed her support, and for now, that was enough. As I drove back home, I passed the park where Brian and I used to walk together every Sunday morning. I remembered how he used to hold my hand. How he once looked at me like I was his entire universe, like nothing else in the world mattered. That man was dead. Maybe he never existed at all. The stranger waiting for me at home now was wearing familiar skin, but there was nothing left inside that I recognized. And tonight, that stranger was going to sit me down, look me in the eyes, and ask me to disappear from his life. He had absolutely no idea that I was already planning how to ensure it would be him who lost everything. When I walked through the front door that evening, I knew immediately what was coming. The conversation, the performance. He'd rehearsed it carefully in his mind, probably practiced his expressions in the mirror. I could read it all over his face, that forced concern, the artificial heaviness in his shoulders. Brian Carter was about to pretend to be the sympathetic good guy in his own betrayal story. "Hey," he said, voice deliberately low and gentle. "We should talk." I gave him a tired, defeated smile. Just enough to appear worn down, just enough to keep him confident in his delusion. "Sure," I replied softly, dropping my bag by the door. "What's going on?" He gestured toward the living room. We sat facing each other again, the same setup as before. The couch, the wine glasses, the practiced solemnity. He'd even dimmed the lights and draped a blanket over the armrest, like this was going to be some tender mutual discussion, like he was doing me a tremendous favor by dismantling my life gently. I took my seat. He settled into the armchair across from me, lacing his fingers together, releasing a theatrical sigh so over the top I nearly burst out laughing. "Rachel," he began gravely, "I've been thinking a lot lately, about us, about where we are, and I think if we're being honest with ourselves, we've grown apart." I kept my gaze fixed on the wine glass, nodding slightly. "Okay. I don't want this to become ugly," he continued, leaning forward earnestly. "I don't want lawyers or courtrooms or any of that drama. I just think it's time we both admitted this marriage isn't working anymore." He sounded absolutely heartbroken, like he was the victim here, like this decision was tearing him apart inside. "I mean, with you being out of work now," he added with practiced gentleness, "maybe this is actually a good opportunity, a fresh start, for both of us." My stomach churned with disgust. I let my bottom lip tremble just slightly. Just enough. "You're saying, divorce?" He nodded solemnly, reaching for his wine glass like he deserved a victory toast. "Yeah, but amicable, civil, I don't want any fighting, and I'm willing to help you get back on your feet. You'll obviously need somewhere to stay, some money to get settled. I want to make this as easy as possible for you." I tilted my head, playing fragile. "You'd really do that for me?" "Of course," he said, placing a hand over his heart like some kind of benevolent savior. "I still care about you, Rachel. I don't think we're right for each other anymore. We've both changed." He paused dramatically, then added, "And the house, It's legally mine. It was left to me by my father, but I want to be fair about this. I'll offer you a small settlement, something to help cover your rent for a few months while you figure things out." I blinked slowly, released a shaky breath. "How much are you offering?" He named a number. It was laughable, insulting. A tiny fraction of what I'd personally invested into that home over the years. But I didn't laugh. I didn't flinch. Instead, I stared at him like I was truly seeing him for the very first time. I thought we'd at least try harder," I whispered, voice cracking. "I thought we were stronger than this." Brian reached across and touched my hand gently, like a man playing a role he no longer cared about performing well. "I'm sorry, but this really is the best path forward. I promise you'll understand eventually." And right then, right in that moment, I gave him exactly what he wanted. I nodded slowly, eyes glistening with unshed tears, lips pressed tight in apparent defeat. "Okay," I said quietly. "I'll think about it." He exhaled, visibly relieved, completely satisfied with his performance. But behind my trembling breath and wet lashes, I was already constructing my counterattack, because he didn't want lawyers involved. But I was going to bring in the best one in the entire city. The next morning, I slipped out of the house before Brian even began to stir. He was still sprawled on the couch, buried beneath a blanket like a child hiding from consequences. I didn't bother leaving a note. No polite explanation, no gentle goodbye, just silence. Let him wonder what I was up to. Downtown Portland was just beginning to wake up when I stepped into the weathered brick building where Monica Bell's law office was tucked between a small florist and a modest tax accountant. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. I sat in the cramped waiting room for 10 minutes that stretched like hours, silently rehearsing what I needed to say. But when Monica finally opened her office door and called my name, I stood up, walked in, sat down, and told her everything. Well, almost everything. I left out the specific details about Claire and the baby, about the betrayal so profound it made my voice crack every time I thought about it, but I gave her enough. Enough for a seasoned divorce attorney to clearly see the battlefield stretching out before us. The inherited house, the years of shared living expenses, the receipts and bank statements proving my contributions, the insulting settlement offer, the desperate push for a quick, quiet divorce. Monica listened without a trace of judgment on her face. Her expression remained calm and analytical as her pen glided smoothly across a yellow legal pad like it had been trained for exactly this kind of warfare. "You've been married how long?" she asked precisely. 12 years, I corrected. 10 legally married, 2 years together before that. She nodded, made a note. "Any children?" "No. And you have documented proof of your financial contributions to the property." Receipts, invoices, bank transfers, everything, the kitchen renovation, the bathroom tiles, the appliances, all paid from my personal accounts. She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands thoughtfully. "Rachel, you have a legitimate case here, a strong one, but I need you to understand something important before we proceed. If we move forward with this, there's no turning back. It won't be pretty. And based on what you've described, he's probably going to fight very dirty." I looked her directly in the eyes. He already is. Her expression didn't shift, but something flickered behind her gaze. Recognition, maybe, or respect. Then let's get to work. When I stepped outside into the crisp morning air, everything felt different somehow. Cleaner, lighter. I still had an enormous mountain to climb, but for the first time in days, the suffocating weight pressing down on my chest had begun to lift. I wasn't flailing helplessly in darkness anymore. I finally had someone in my corner, someone who understood the battlefield, someone who knew exactly how to fight. I drove straight to the office after that. No more hiding, no more pretending. I walked through those doors with my head held high, greeted my team warmly, sat down at my desk, and dove into the departmental dashboard like nothing had happened. Brian still believed I was unemployed, lost, vulnerable, defeated. Meanwhile, I was back at full strength. My phone buzzed around lunchtime. A text from him. "Hope your job interviews went well today. Let me know when you're ready to discuss next steps." Next steps. I almost laughed out loud at the audacity. He had absolutely no idea I'd already taken mine. I typed back a simple response. "We'll see." That afternoon, I met with my team, reviewed quarterly objectives, scheduled one-on-one meetings, and personally approved a significant new client project. I was efficient, focused, completely unshakable. And when I finally walked out of the building at sunset, something had shifted permanently within me. I wasn't the same trembling woman who once hid in hallways crying, who sat paralyzed in silence while her husband casually planned her erasure. That woman was gone forever. In her place stood someone transformed, someone stronger, sharper, ready for anything. Brian wanted me to disappear quietly into the night, but now I was preparing to take everything back, on my terms. Brian was waiting when I arrived home that evening. He stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, trying desperately to project calm confidence. But the subtle twitch in his jaw, the nervous shifting of his weight from one foot to the other, told the real story beneath the performance. He was nervous, possibly even scared. "Hey," he said casually, like we were just roommates discussing whose turn it was to buy groceries. "You got a minute?" I hung up my coat slowly, deliberately. Then turned to face him. "Sure." He nodded toward the living room. We assumed our positions again, seated across from each other. Same setup as every other staged conversation. The couch, the wine glasses, the manufactured gravity. He clearly believed his first performance had worked perfectly, that I had dutifully accepted his carefully prepared script. "I've been thinking," he began smoothly. "I want to finalize everything soon. The divorce, the paperwork, all of it. Get things wrapped up cleanly so we can both move forward with our lives." I nodded softly. "Okay." He blinked, clearly surprised by my apparent compliance. "So, you agree then? I'm not going to fight the divorce itself," I said gently, "but I do want to fully understand what's actually fair here, so I've spoken with someone about it." He went completely rigid. "Someone, you mean? A lawyer?" His eyes immediately narrowed with suspicion and barely concealed anger. "Why would you possibly need a lawyer? I already offered you a perfectly generous settlement. We can handle this ourselves like reasonable adults." I tilted my head innocently. "You mentioned the house was legally yours, correct?" "It is," he said quickly. Too quickly. "But we've both lived here together for over a decade now. I've invested significant amounts of my own money. I have every receipt. I just want to ensure everything is handled fairly." He forced out a sharp laugh, defensive and dismissive. "Rachel, come on, you're completely blowing this out of proportion. You lived here. That's not remotely the same as actually owning anything." "I personally paid for the entire kitchen remodel," I said softly but firmly. "The bathroom tiles, the appliances, all documented transfers from my personal bank accounts. I simply want those contributions properly acknowledged." Brian jumped to his feet, pacing now with visible agitation. "I really don't want this to get ugly, Rachel. Then don't insult me with a settlement amount that barely covers 3 months of rent somewhere decent." He spun toward me, and for the first time the carefully constructed mask slipped completely. I saw it clearly, a flash of pure anger, of genuine panic. "You're being completely unreasonable about this." "No," I said calmly, steadily. "I'm being smart. You actually taught me that yourself, remember? Plan ahead. Always protect your assets." He ran frustrated fingers through his hair, eyes darting around the room. "You really want to do this? Really want to get lawyers involved and turn this into some ugly legal battle? You think that's actually a good idea?" "I think it's absolutely necessary," I replied evenly. "You said you wanted things handled fairly. Well, this is precisely how fairness works in the real world." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just stared at me, trying to recalculate, attempting to reframe who I was inside his mind. I was clearly no longer the fragile, broken wife he thought he'd already defeated. I had become something else entirely now, a problem he hadn't anticipated. "So what exactly are you planning to demand?" he finally muttered. "Half of the entire house?" "I don't want half," I said firmly. "Just what I personally put in. Plus perhaps a little extra compensation for all the years you spent deliberately lying to my face." His jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles strain. He didn't deny my accusation, didn't even attempt to flinch or defend himself, and in that weighted silence, I knew with absolute certainty. He was finally, genuinely afraid. He had assumed I would shatter into pieces at his feet. He never once imagined I would sharpen into steel instead. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. It wasn't quiet, it wasn't quick, it wasn't clean. Brian dragged everything out the moment he realized I wasn't simply going to roll over and play dead. His lawyer, probably some smug old friend he'd bragged about to his mother, deployed every dirty trick imaginable. But Monica was sharper, smarter, absolutely ruthless when circumstances demanded. She had organized copies of every receipt, every bank transfer, every signature I'd ever made regarding that house. We didn't pursue anything beyond what was legitimately fair. But we made absolutely certain Brian couldn't keep what rightfully wasn't his. In the end, I walked away with a substantial settlement and complete legal recognition of all my contributions, not just financially, but as a partner who had invested years of her life building something she believed was real before he decided to burn it all down. The last time I saw Brian in person, we were signing final documents in a sterile conference room somewhere downtown. Claire wasn't physically present, but I could sense her ghost hovering behind his shoulder. Quiet, passive, patiently waiting to slide into my place the moment I officially disappeared from his life. Brian refused to meet my eyes throughout the entire signing, not even once. When it was finally over, I stood up from the table, tucked the pen into my bag as a memento, and said simply, "You always underestimated me." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. I could read everything written across his face. Regret? Possibly. Or maybe just pure disbelief that the story he'd so carefully written for me hadn't ended the way he planned. I moved into a small apartment with a view overlooking the river. Nothing fancy, nothing particularly spacious, but it was completely mine. That first night sleeping there, I left every single light burning bright. Not out of fear, but simply because I could. No one to call me dramatic or wasteful. No one to make me feel like a burden for existing. Just peaceful, earned silence. Word eventually filtered back to me that Claire and Brian were experiencing adjustment issues. Apparently, their fantasy life together wasn't quite as idyllic as they'd imagined during all their secret planning. Raising a child turned out to be significantly more complicated than posing for happy photos, and pretending love could simply be transplanted from one relationship into another. Linda naturally tried inserting herself as the solution, swooping in to micromanage their lives the way she'd always done. But I heard through Emily that tensions were escalating, that money was tighter than anyone expected, that Claire hadn't quite integrated into the family dynamic the way Linda had always hoped. None of it surprised me even slightly. Their entire new life was built on a foundation of lies. And lies don't hold foundations together for very long. I don't waste my days obsessively monitoring their situation anymore. I don't stalk social media or marinate in bitterness. I've been methodically rebuilding my life from the ground up in my own way, at my own pace. Slowly, deliberately, intentionally, my career remains solid, respected. I eat dinner alone many nights, but I've learned through experience that solitude is fundamentally different from loneliness. Sometimes solitude is simply healing. I started taking boxing classes on Saturday mornings, something fierce and physical to channel everything I'd been holding inside. I rediscovered my love of reading poetry late at night. I call my sister every Sunday now without fail. I've even started writing again, something I abandoned back in college and hadn't touched in almost 15 years. There are pieces of myself I genuinely believed were lost forever. But they weren't truly gone. They were simply buried deep beneath years of making myself smaller, of constantly shrinking to accommodate someone else's fragile ego. Now I take up every inch of space I need without apology. If there's one lesson this entire painful experience burned into my soul, it's this. Being underestimated is actually the most dangerous gift life can ever hand you. Because when you finally rise, when you fight back with everything you've got, absolutely no one sees it coming. Brian fully expected me to crumble into dust at his feet. Instead, I became completely unshakable.